November 2nd, 1963. An armored personnel carrier crawled through the streets of Che Lun, the Chinese-Vietnamese district of Saigon. Inside the steel hull, two brothers sat with their hands tied behind their backs. The older man was 62. For 9 years, he had ruled the southern half of a divided nation. He survived 3 communist assassination attempts, a paratrooper revolt, a direct aerial bombing of his own palace. He had been welcomed at the White House by a sitting American president, hailed as the miracle of Asia by senators and cardinals alike. And yet, on this Saturday morning, trapped in the back of a military vehicle, traveling from a small Catholic church to the headquarters of the very army he once commanded, his reign was over. The vehicle was an M113. It was an American-built armored carrier, supplied to the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, built to rush soldiers into battle. But this morning, it carried a deposed president and his younger brother. Their wrists were bound. They were headed for the Joint General Staff compound at Dan Sun Nhut Air Base. Less than an hour prior, they had surrendered after attending Mass and taking Holy Communion, believing they were guaranteed safe transport. By the time the convoy arrived, both men were dead. His name was Ngo Dinh Diem, the first president of the Republic of Vietnam, and the founding head of state for what the world called South Vietnam. In under 2 years, he forged a country out of absolute chaos. He crushed armed criminal syndicates, dismantled religious militias, and outlasted a colonial military establishment that desperately wanted him gone. He survived plots that would have ruined other leaders in weeks. He oversaw the resettlement of nearly 900,000 refugees fleeing the north after partition. He took a fractured landscape of warring factions and built a sovereign state, recognized by the United States, the Vatican, and dozens of global governments. He did all this as a celibate Catholic mandarin, a man who kept a rosary in his pocket, attended daily mass, and governed with the unshakable conviction that God had placed him exactly where he belonged. Here on ARVN and U.S. Military, we do not just read history, we live it. These are the narratives that defined one of the most complex conflicts of the 20th century. If you are new to the channel, make sure to subscribe. You really do not want to miss this one. Stick around until the end, because those final hours of the presidency expose a truth about the relationship between Saigon and Washington that official records would never dare admit. Tell us in the comments what ultimately defined Ngo Dinh Diem. Was it the nation he built from absolute scratch? Or those fateful decisions in his final summer that handed foreign and domestic enemies the opening they had been waiting for? How does a head of state end up dead in the back of an armored vehicle driving down his own army's road? To understand that, we have to look back, not at his childhood in central Vietnam, not the family tree, or the Catholic upbringing. Those details matter, but they are not the core of the story. The real story lies in his actions as a man, what he chose, what he rejected, who he trusted, and who he absolutely refused to trust until it was far too late. He was born in central Vietnam, right at the dawn of the 20th century. His Catholic Mandarin family had served the imperial court in Hue for generations. His father was a senior official under Emperor Tan Tai and founded one of the nation's most prestigious schools. Their Catholic roots stretch back to the 17th century, meaning they had survived brutal waves of persecution under earlier dynasties. They learned to practice their faith quietly, to serve the state with diligence, to understand that loyalty was rarely rewarded. By 1921, when young Ngo Dinh Diem graduated near the top of his class from the School of Public Administration and Law in Hanoi, he already understood his family's core lessons. Power was a strict duty. Faith was absolutely non-negotiable. And the foreigners ruling Vietnam, French or otherwise, were strictly temporary. He entered the Imperial Civil Service in his early 20s and climbed the ranks with unusual speed. By 25, he was a province chief. Both his Vietnamese subordinates and French superiors viewed him as practically incorruptible. He brought his rosary to the office. He kept his own counsel, and he got results. The colonial system certainly noticed him. So did Emperor Bao Dai, the young monarch installed by the French as a mere figurehead. In May of 1933, Bao Dai tried to form a cabinet to gently push back against French control. He named the rising young mandarin from Quang Binh as Minister of the Interior. It was the highest rank a Vietnamese official could reach under colonial rule. Looking back, it was also the exact moment that revealed the man he would always be. He held the post for barely 2 months. It soon became obvious the French had zero intention of granting the reforms Bao Dai promised. The cabinet post was a ceremonial fiction meant only to placate the Vietnamese public. So the young minister did something almost no other official of his generation would dare. He resigned. He surrendered his sash and his official seal, and he walked out. He never sought another office. He refused to make peace with the colonial administration. He just went home. For the next 21 years, he stayed out of politics, lived quietly, read theology and history. He simply prayed and watched from the margins. He saw Japanese forces occupy Vietnam during the Second World War. He saw the French return to reclaim their colony, and he watched a former teacher and revolutionary named Ho Chi Minh build a communist-led independence movement, one that would eventually grind the entire French military project in Indochina into dust. People offered him positions during those years. He refused every single one. In 1945, in the chaotic aftermath of the Japanese surrender, the Viet Minh seized his older brother, Ngo Dinh Diem, the governor of Quang Nam province. Along with his son, both were murdered. The extreme violence of the period obscured the exact details, but the family knew the truth. The communist movement had decided the Ngo family was in the way. The very next year, in 1946, Ho Chi Minh himself summoned Ngo Dinh Diem to Hanoi. The communist leader needed credible nationalists to legitimize the new Democratic Republic of Vietnam. He offered the Catholic Mandarin a government post. Surviving accounts of that meeting say the visitor calmly reminded his host that the Viet Minh had slaughtered his brother. Ho Chi Minh denied any personal responsibility. The visitor rejected the offer and walked straight out of the room. He was allowed to leave unharmed. Both men would remember that exchange, in very different ways, for the rest of their lives. By the early 1950s, the Indochina War was nearing its breaking point. The French were completely exhausted, terrified of a communist sweep through Southeast Asia. The Americans were quietly bankrolling the French military effort. Meanwhile, the displaced Vietnamese Mandarin was no longer even in Vietnam. He traveled abroad first to Rome for an audience with Pope Pius XII, then across to the United States. He spent the early part of the decade living at Maryknoll Catholic seminaries in New Jersey and New York. He read, wrote, lectured at American universities. All the while, he built a quiet, powerful network of relationships that would rewrite his future. He met Cardinal Francis Spellman of New York, the single most powerful Catholic clergyman in America. He met Mike Mansfield, a senator from Montana who would later become the Senate Majority Leader. He sat down with a young Massachusetts senator named John F. Kennedy, who saw the Vietnamese exile as a viable alternative to both French colonialism and communist rule. He met Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas. He spoke with scholars, diplomats, and foundation officers. To every single one of them, in his quiet, polite, deeply Catholic manner, he pitched a bold vision, a Vietnam that was neither colonial nor communist, a sovereign nation standing firm in the new Cold War order, if only the right leader emerged at precisely the right moment. In 1953, he moved to a Benedictine monastery in Belgium. There, he waited. He prayed. Then, in the spring of 1954, half a world away, the French garrison at Dien Bien Phu was entirely overrun by the People's Army of Vietnam, commanded by General Von Nguyen Giap.
That crushing defeat broke the French will to fight.
By summer, the Geneva Accords divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel. The communist-led Democratic Republic of Vietnam took the north, while the state of Vietnam, still nominally under Emperor Bao Dai, held the south. The southern half of the country desperately needed a prime minister. The Americans needed a figure who could credibly lead a non-communist state. Bao Dai needed a man the French could not control, and who would not fold under pressure from Hanoi. At that specific moment in mid-1954, exactly one Vietnamese figure checked every single box. He was sitting in a monastery in Belgium. He was 53 years old, and he had not held a public office in 21 years. June 16, 1954. Inside a hotel suite in France, Emperor Bao Dai appointed Ngo Dinh Diem as Prime Minister of the state of Vietnam. Exactly 9 days later, the new leader stepped off an airplane onto the tarmac at Ton Son Nhut Air Base. It was the exact same airfield where, 9 years and 4 months later, his body would be delivered in the back of an armored personnel carrier. He stepped into a fractured nation that frankly had no idea what to do with him. Saigon in the summer of 1954 was a city simply holding its breath. The Geneva Accords had been signed just weeks prior. That 17th parallel was now a hard international boundary. Hundreds of thousands of displaced people, most of them Catholic, were already fleeing south along muddy roads and rivers. They were abandoning ancestral villages their families had farmed for centuries. The French military lingered, though they no longer commanded their own fate. Over at the American embassy, officers and diplomats operated without any clear policy, and the newly appointed prime minister arriving at his official residence on June 26th inherited a fractured state. In practical terms, he controlled perhaps a few square miles of central Saigon. What he had been handed was not a country at all. It was merely a brutal collection of armed factions occupying the exact same geography. Take the Binh Xuyen. This organized crime syndicate, built entirely from river pirates and ruthless street gangs, controlled the capital police force. They ran the gambling houses, the opium dens, and those floating brothels along the Saigon River. Their leader had literally bought the police commission straight from the imperial court. They boasted a private army of several thousand heavily armed men, and they paid taxes to absolutely no one but themselves. Down in the southwest, two incredibly powerful religious movements maintained their own private armies. First, the Cao Dai, a syncretic faith blending Catholicism, Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism. They commanded roughly 20,000 troops stationed around their holy see in Tay Ninh. Then there was the Hua Hao, a reformed Buddhist sect founded in the 1930s, who controlled vast stretches of the Mekong Delta with their own heavily armed militia. Neither faction recognized the new government's authority in Saigon. Both groups had actually been armed and heavily subsidized by the French during the brutal war against the Viet Minh. Then there was the National Army. The Prime Minister was supposed to command it, but it was led by a French-trained general named Nguyen Van Hinh. Hinh held dual citizenship, having served as a pilot in the French Air Force. He remained fiercely loyal to the French military establishment and held nothing but absolute contempt for this new civilian government. Barely days after the appointment, Hinh was openly boasting to officers that the Prime Minister would not last 3 months. He openly discussed staging a military coup and even kept a running list of commanders who would gladly join him. Out in the distant countryside, the Viet Minh had officially withdrawn their military forces north of the 17th parallel under the Geneva Accords. Yet they left behind deeply embedded cadres, sympathizers, and shadow networks woven throughout the rural population. The communists never actually surrendered the South. They simply vanished underground, quietly waiting for those nationwide reunification elections promised for 1956. This was his poisoned inheritance. Diem established himself inside the Norodom Palace. the old French governor's residence, resting right in the center of Saigon.
He brought along a tiny, insular circle of trusted figures, almost exclusively family members. His younger brother, Ngo Dinh Diem, became his closest political advisor and chief of intelligence. Ngo had spent the war years quietly building a clandestine political network known as the Gun Lao Party. Ngo's wife, Trun Lê Xuân, also moved into the palace with their family. She was 30 years old, strikingly sharp, articulate in French, flawlessly fluent in English. Since girlhood, she had been rigorously trained in the delicate social rituals of Vietnamese high society and French colonial diplomacy. The prime minister himself was a lifelong celibate Catholic under a strict personal vow never to marry. Because of this, his powerful sister-in-law would gradually step up and assume the very public role of First Lady. The very first American to step through the Prime Minister's office door on June 26th, the day after his arrival, was a 46-year-old Air Force colonel named Edward Lansdale. He carried a single folded piece of paper in his pocket. It was, as he put it, a purely personal and unofficial memorandum outlining immediate steps the new government might want to consider. The document proposed integrating those scattered non-communist paramilitary forces into one unified national army. It suggested aggressively encouraging nationalist groups to join the political process. Finally, it outlined sweeping agrarian and economic reforms, anything to make this distant government feel visible and genuinely useful to the rural population. The Prime Minister read every word carefully. He asked sharp questions. He committed to absolutely nothing. Lansdale had slipped into Saigon a few weeks earlier, officially working under the cover of an assistant air attaché at the American embassy. In reality, his actual employer was the Central Intelligence Agency. His true assignment was to weaponize the exact same techniques of political and psychological warfare he had used just years prior against the Huk communist insurgency in the Philippines. Back in Manila, Lansdale had closely attached himself to a young Filipino politician named Ramon Magsaysay, personally helping engineer his rapid rise to the presidency. Now, amidst the chaotic environment of southern Vietnam, Lansdale was desperately hunting for a local figure who could play that exact same role. He was pretty certain he had found his man. The two began meeting regularly, sometimes daily, tucked away in a cramped alcove right off the Prime Minister's bedroom. The tiny room was walled with books and towering stacks of documents. It had just one single small window. Diem talked for hours. Lansdale just sat and listened. The American officer later described those intense sessions as something falling somewhere between a political seminar and a quiet religious retreat. One of Lansdale's colleagues on the Saigon military mission noted that the new Vietnamese leader trusted the colonel about as much as he trusted any foreigner, which meant not entirely, but still vastly more than anyone else in the room. The Hin crisis hit almost immediately. By September, General Hin was issuing brazen public statements. He strongly suggested the military would not remain under civilian control if the government continued in its current form. He granted lengthy interviews to French journalists. He constantly surrounded himself with loyal officers who shared his bitter contempt for the Prime Minister. Hin even began repositioning military units, heavily signaling preparations for an armed takeover. Come October, the sweltering streets of Saigon were completely flooded with rumors that the army would seize the palace before the year was out. The American response was dangerously uncertain. Certain officials back in Washington were actually prepared to let Hin succeed, reasoning that the Prime Minister needed to manage the crisis himself. Others, especially Lansdale, argued fiercely that allowing a French-aligned general to topple a civilian leader would instantly destroy any hope of building an independent, non-communist state. The bitter debate reached the very highest levels of government. Finally, President Dwight Eisenhower decided he had to send a senior emissary. November 3rd, the president officially announced the appointment of General Joseph Lawton Collins the former Army Chief of Staff and active representative to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. He was named Special United States Representative to Vietnam, carrying the personal rank of ambassador. Collins touched down in Saigon days later, armed with a massive public pledge of $100 million in American aid. Standing right on the airport tarmac, he made it crystal clear that financial assistance would go to the existing government and to that government alone. The pledge worked like magic. General Hin's rigid calculations suddenly shifted. Those exact same Army officers who had been eager to join his coup quietly began to reconsider. Behind the scenes, Lansdale furiously worked those officers in private, sometimes floating heavy financial inducements, other times merely pointing out the new American posture. By late November, Hin's grand coalition was rapidly crumbling apart. Watching the entire mess unfold from the sunny French Riviera, Emperor Bao Dai finally summoned Hin to France. The general obeyed the imperial order and flew out of Saigon. He never came back. Without firing a single shot, the massive army he had threatened to unleash against the prime minister had completely slipped through his fingers. It marked the very first major victory for the new government, and it was largely achieved by an American general delivering a very public pledge, backed by an American colonel frantically working private channels at midnight. Honestly, the prime minister himself had done little beyond holding his nerve and outright refusing to abandon the palace. Yet in the volatile autumn of 1954, simply holding your nerve was a massive accomplishment. But here is what no one in Saigon fully grasped yet. Something the prime minister himself likely missed entirely. That exact same American support that had just saved him from General Hin would soon mutate into something far more complicated than a simple guarantee. General Collins had not flown all the way to Saigon to act as an unconditional patron. He arrived as a hard-headed combat veteran, fully intending to make his own ruthless assessment of the man Washington was backing. And by the end of his very first month in Vietnam, that assessment was already turning terribly negative. Collins stood back and watched the prime minister operate. He saw a stubborn man who absolutely refused to delegate, a leader wasting hours micromanaging tiny administrative details that lower-level ministers should have easily handled. He witnessed the head of state who conducted entire cabinet meetings as uninterrupted monologues, constantly talking over his own subordinates, treating basic political consultation like a complete waste of breath. This was a man relying almost exclusively on his own family members and a tight-knit ring of Catholic confidants. In short, Collins saw a deeply flawed personality that simply could not run a modern state. So the general started quietly firing off cables to Washington, strongly recommending the prime minister be replaced. Late 1954 bled into the early weeks of 1955. Inside the American policy machine, two very different visions of a non-communist Vietnam were taking shape. General Collins, backed by senior State Department officers, saw the prime minister as sincere but limited. They believed his strict Catholic Mandarin worldview made building a broad national coalition impossible. Their advice was simple: encourage Emperor Bao Dai to find a replacement before American prestige sank with a failing project. But Lansdale pushed a totally different view. Quietly and relentlessly, he argued the prime minister was the absolute only figure capable of resisting French manipulation and communist pressure alike. To Lansdale, the man's rigidity was the exact same thing as his integrity. Abandoning him, he warned, meant handing the South straight to Hanoi. Washington ended the year totally divided. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles leaned toward Lansdale. Other senior officials backed Collins. A choice had to be made eventually. When that moment finally arrived the following spring, it would be decided under intense pressure and with almost no time. But what was about to unfold on the streets of Saigon during those crucial months would completely rewrite the entire calculation.
The Prime Minister knew almost nothing about these internal American debates. He just kept preparing for his second year in office. January arrived with a blinding dust storm of paperwork. Cables crossed the Pacific in both directions almost every single hour. Military advisors, French liaison officers, ministers, and staff jammed the corridors of Norodom Palace day and night. The Prime Minister kept working well past midnight. He reviewed files himself, signed orders one by one. He flatly refused to delegate even routine decisions to his own cabinet. His brother Ngo drafted policy memos. His sister-in-law hosted state luncheons. And that American colonel from the embassy kept making his almost daily visits to the small alcove right off the bedroom. But the Prime Minister did not actually have a country to govern yet, just the immediate streets of Saigon.
The Binh Xuyen still controlled the police. Their leader was Le Van Vien, known everywhere as Bai Vien. He ran the capital's underworld with a permit personally signed by Emperor Bao Dai. Officially, he was commander of the national police. His armored units held the bridges. His paramilitary forces shook down merchants along the river for protection money. He bought his commission with hard cash, sending regular installments straight back to the imperial court in France. To Bai Vien, this new prime minister was just a temporary inconvenience. Through January and February, the prime minister moved with extreme caution. He built ties with junior officers in the Vietnamese National Army, the same force that once served General Hin. He organized loans and payoffs for influential Cao Dai and Hua Hao figures, hoping to fold their militias into the National Army instead of fighting them. Lansdale handled a few of these talks himself. Central Intelligence Agency cash flowed through Vietnamese middlemen straight to sect leaders willing to listen. By February, a senior Cao Dai commander named Trinh Minh Thi, who ran his own private army in the hills outside Tay Ninh, finally agreed to bring his troops over to the government side. It was the slow, painfully undramatic work of building a state, and General Collins watched it from the American embassy with mounting dread. The embassy felt the prime minister was just buying time with bribes and duct tape instead of actually building institutions. Reports flowing back to Washington grew darker by the week.
By late February, Collins was sending private cables to Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. His verdict was brutal. The man Washington backed simply lacked the political skill to hold the country together. Dulles arrived in Saigon for a personal visit on February 28th. He met the prime minister at the palace. Afterward, he publicly promised the Vietnamese leader the rock-solid support of the United States government. The statement was deliberately aggressive. Dulles wanted the press, the French, and every local faction to hear it loud and clear. Less than 4 weeks later, Collins told that exact same prime minister in private that his American support was about to be completely pulled. The reason for the massive shift was not Washington, it was Saigon. In late March, the Binh Xuyen finally decided to make their move. The spark was a government order stripping the Binh Xuyen of their gambling and police concessions. The prime minister realized he could not share his capital with an organized crime syndicate anymore, so he went straight after their money. Bai Vien answered immediately. On the night of March 29th, Binh Xuyen forces opened fire on the army units guarding the palace. Mortar shells tore up the gardens. Machine guns raked the stone walls. They fought for several hours before someone finally managed to broker a temporary ceasefire. It was not a coup, just a warning. Any attempt to force civilian authority onto the capital would trigger open warfare right in the streets. The crisis fractured the American mission.
Collins decided the situation was totally unmanageable. The prime minister had to go before the city burned in a civil war. In late April, he flew to Washington to make his case in person. For an entire week, the State Department, the National Security Council, and President Eisenhower himself debated one terrible question. Should they abandon the Vietnamese leader they had backed for barely a year? On April 27th, Washington drafted a cable. It authorized the Saigon embassy to quietly prepare for a transition to a brand new Vietnamese government. Dulles himself signed off on it. It was the absolute closest thing to a final execution order for the Prime Minister's career, and they sent it within hours. Events on the ground overtook it. On the morning of April 28th, that cable was still being decoded at the embassy, and then the Binh Xuyen opened fire again. This was no warning. Bay Vien decided it was time to completely destroy the new government. His forces hit multiple points across the capital all at once. Heavy artillery hammered the streets. Fires swallowed up entire neighborhoods. The violence bled into the central districts of Saigon and raged on for days. The Vietnamese National Army, the exact same force General Hinh almost weaponized against the Prime Minister months earlier, was ordered to fight back. The Prime Minister gave the order personally. He ignored his American advisors, who were terrified the army would shatter under fire. But the army held.
Loyalist commanders took the units they had carefully cultivated all winter and marched straight into the contested zones. They engaged the Binh Xuyen in brutal, sustained combat. The fighting was horrific. Several hundred Vietnamese died in the crossfire. Tens of thousands of civilians fled their homes as massive fires swept through Chinese, Vietnamese, and French neighborhoods alike. Trinh Minh Thi, the Cao Dai commander who flipped to the government side in February, was killed on May 3rd. He died leading his troops against Binh Xuyen positions on a bridge right over the canal separating central Saigon from Cho Lan. By the second week of May, the Binh Xuyen were pushed completely out of the capital. Surviving units scattered into the swamps of the Rung Sac. Bai Vien himself fled to France to live out his days in exile. The crime syndicate that strangled Saigon for years was entirely finished as a political and military power. The civilian government took back the police commission. Gambling houses were shut down. Opium concessions were permanently revoked. That April 27th Washington cable, the one authorizing preparations to replace the Prime Minister, was quietly withdrawn. Lansdale played a massive role in this reversal. While Collins sat in Washington, demanding the Prime Minister be fired, Lansdale was deep in the Saigon trenches. He coordinated intelligence between army commanders. He advised on tactical deployments, and he fired off his own cables to Washington, insisting their guy was actually winning the unwinnable battle.
By mid-May, the blood on the streets settled the argument once and for all. Dulles personally reversed their stance, and Eisenhower accepted it. The American partnership with the Prime Minister was officially restored, and General Collins was quietly called back home. Defeating the Binh Xuyen changed absolutely everything inside Vietnam. It completely altered how the army viewed their civilian commander. It scrambled the political math for the remaining sect leaders. It even changed the way the Prime Minister walked into a room. The Americans, the French, the press, and the local politicians had all written him off as just another transitional figure. But he fought them all, and he won. Over the following months, the Hoa Hao militia was systematically dismantled. A few commanders surrendered, folding their units into the National Army. Others fought and lost. Ba Kut, the most relentless of the Hoa Hao military leaders, was captured the next year. He faced public execution by guillotine in July 1956. Meanwhile, the Cao Dai military structure merged into the National Army through quiet negotiations and heavy pressure. By autumn, not a single organized armed force in southern Vietnam, aside from underground communist networks, held the capacity to challenge the central government. The Prime Minister now held a country. He also controlled the political language of legitimacy in the South, unlike any Vietnamese leader before him. He crushed the Binh Xuyen without French help. He sidelined the sects without massive American combat support. He outplayed General Hinh.
He even survived the Collins recommendation, and he pulled it all off in less than 12 months. Given the fractured political universe he was operating inside, it was nothing short of staggering. It was also the exact moment his next major problem came into focus.
Emperor Bao Dai still technically remained head of state, though he lived in France. During the Binh Xuyen crisis, he tried summoning the prime minister to Cannes for consultations. The prime minister refused to go. So, Bao Dai attempted to strip him of his office by imperial decree. That decree was flatly ignored. By late summer 1955, pretending the state of Vietnam was a monarchy under an absent emperor became impossible. The prime minister, his brother Ngo, and their political allies mapped out the next move. They would organize a national referendum. Voters would be asked to choose between Bao Dai and the man who broke the Binh Xuyen. In reality, the public would not be free to choose at all. But the illusion of choice mattered deeply. The referendum was set for October 23, 1955. This October referendum campaign looked nothing like what an American or European voter might recognize. 0 televised debates, 0 rallies for the opposition, absolutely no neutral election observers. Instead, there were 2 ballots. One showed Emperor Bao Dai wearing his ceremonial robes. The other displayed the prime minister. Voters were told to drop their chosen candidate into the box and tear the rejected ballot firmly in half.
The ballots were intentionally color-coded. The prime minister got red, a traditional symbol of good fortune and prosperity in Vietnamese culture. The emperor got green, tied by folk belief to unfaithfulness and bad luck. Kun Lao party officials heavily supervised the polling stations. Anyone selecting the green ballot was watched. In some districts, voters faced quiet intimidation. In others, they were physically beaten. The modern secret ballot simply did not exist here. People voted on Sunday, October 23, 1955. Shortly after, official results handed the prime minister over 98% of the national tally. In the Saigon district alone, the announced figures claimed more votes for the new candidate than actual registered voters in the entire city. The margin of fraud was so massive, it instantly embarrassed the Americans who had backed the referendum. Colonel Edward Lansdale later admitted in his writings that he had privately warned against publishing such a wildly inflated number. He pushed for a believable figure, something closer to 70%. That advice was completely ignored. Still, the results served its ultimate political purpose. Watching from France, Bao Dai knew the monarchy was dead. He issued no more decrees. He never returned to Vietnam. Instead, he lived out his remaining years in European exile, a quiet man, haunting hotel bars and casinos. The former emperor of a nation that no longer formally existed. On October 26, 1955, 3 days post-referendum, the prime minister stood at a Saigon microphone and declared the state of Vietnam dissolved. In its place, he announced the birth of the Republic of Vietnam. The Nguyen dynasty, rulers of the Vietnamese people in some form since 1802, was totally abolished. This new republic operated as a presidential system, and the incoming president, surprising absolutely no one, was the man standing at the microphone. He took the oath of office that very afternoon. He was 54 years old. Quickly, he renamed the old French governor residence in central Saigon. The grand structure once known as the Ngo Dinh Palace became, from that day onward, the Independence Palace. His presidency launched with an aggressive push for state building. By the next year, a fresh constitution was drafted and ratified. They elected a national assembly, though the rigged conditions virtually guaranteed absolute dominance for the Kun Lao party and its allies. The government bureaucracy ballooned. New ministries formed. Schools went up. Land reform was loudly announced, even if actual progress, especially down in the rural Mekong Delta, proved painfully slow. Meanwhile, the American aid General Collins promised last autumn finally started flowing in earnest. American military advisors,
led by Lieutenant General Samuel Williams through the Military Assistance Advisory Group, tackled a massive job. They began rebuilding the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, trying to forge a military capable of surviving a conventional invasion from the north. Right around this time, foreign opinions of the new Vietnamese president took a dramatic turn. The Western press spent the previous summer basically writing his political obituary.
Now they were obsessed with the sheer puzzle of his survival. Washington had counted him out. Paris wrote him off. So did his emperor, his army commanders, the crime lords running his capital, and the religious militias gripping half the nation. Yet he outlasted every single one of them. And he did it all without leaving his palace for more than a few hours at a time. The international Catholic press practically canonized him. Cardinal Francis Spellman of New York, who hosted him during his exile years in America, became his loudest defender. Catholic publications across the United States and Europe painted him as the ultimate model of Asian Catholic statesmanship. They saw a man whose personal faith and fierce determination offered a real, non-communist alternative for the developing world. American magazines started throwing around a specific phrase, the miracle of Asia. It was not quite a household expression yet, but give it 2 years, and it absolutely would be. Inside the Independence Palace, however, the daily rhythms of power barely shifted. The president still burned the midnight oil, personally reviewing files and refusing to delegate. He still attended Mass every single morning in a small chapel installed near his private quarters. He still locked himself away with his brother Ngo for long, secretive talks about policy and intelligence. Above all, he still leaned on a tiny inner circle. It was drawn almost entirely from his own family. Alongside a tight network of Catholic Mandarin families who once served the imperial court long before the French arrived. This created the defining paradox of the new republic throughout 1956 and 57. Its president forged the country through raw, overwhelming personal will. He broke armies with armies, crushed crime syndicates using security services, and destroyed rivals through sheer political maneuvering. Yet he refused to build any institutions that could let the republic function without him. Every crucial decision had to cross his desk. Every minor appointment, military promotion, infrastructure project, and diplomatic memo passed directly under his eyes. He mistrusted his own ministers. He doubted his generals. He only trusted his family, and his family was small. The American government, watching closely from the embassy and Washington, saw the red flags but did nothing. For the moment, this miracle of Asia was exactly what the United States needed Vietnam to be. The Cold War demanded a clear success story in Southeast Asia, and this new republic was being aggressively sold as just that, raising serious questions in 1956 about the president's dictatorial management style would have only ruined the broader narrative. That narrative reached its absolute peak in the spring of 1957. That April, the United States government extended a highly formal invitation. They asked the President of the Republic of Vietnam to make a state visit to America. Both sides fully understood the gravity of the moment. State visits at this tier were never handed out casually. They broadcast a loud message to the rest of the world. The host country considers this visiting head of state an absolute top-tier partner. The grand visit ran from May 8th through May 19th, 1957. He flew straight to Washington. President Dwight Eisenhower personally greeted him on the tarmac at Washington National Airport, a rare courtesy normally saved for America's closest allies. The two presidents rode side by side in an open car through the Capitol streets, flanked by American flags and the gold and red banner of the new Vietnamese Republic. Later, Eisenhower even hosted a lavish state dinner in his honor right inside the White House. On May 9th, the Vietnamese president stood before a joint session of the United States Congress. He spoke in French, while translators relayed his words in English.
He thanked the American people. Their aid, he said, had made his young republic possible. He outlined the heavy threats his country faced from communist subversion, urging free nations to back each other in the great battle of the century. The room gave him a standing ovation. From Washington, he headed to New York. The city threw him a ticker-tape parade through the financial district. Crowds packed Lower Manhattan. Cardinal Spellman hosted him at the Archdiocese of New York Chancery, and he addressed the United Nations. Time magazine even put his portrait on its cover.
The article inside hailed him as one of the most remarkable Asian leaders of the post-war era. He met with American university presidents, business leaders, religious figures, and political heavyweights from both parties. A young Massachusetts senator who had befriended him during his exile years, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, was now a rising Democratic star with quiet presidential ambitions. Around the time of the visit, Kennedy publicly called Vietnam the cornerstone of the free world in Southeast Asia. That exact phrase would be quoted for years afterward, sometimes by Americans who would deeply regret it. Returning to Saigon in the third week of May, the Vietnamese president had accomplished something totally unprecedented for a leader of his nation. The most powerful government on earth had just received him as the head of a fully sovereign state. The French era was completely over. The United States had loudly rejected the communist alternative. For a fleeting moment, the Republic of Vietnam was the ultimate American success story. Over the following months, the glowing foreign press coverage barely slowed down. Visiting American journalists penned admiring profiles from Saigon. Photographers snapped pictures of fresh public buildings, schools, and resettlement villages built for northern refugees. Both the president and his sister-in-law gave eager interviews. Articles praised the modernization of Vietnamese women, featuring photos of Truong Lê Xuân in her redesigned áo dài. That open collar style she popularized would become the gold standard of Vietnamese formal dress for generations. Inside the country, though, the underground was already busy organizing. Communist cadres who stayed behind in the South after the partition were getting fresh instructions from Hanoi by late 1957 and into 1958. Party leadership in the North finally accepted that those nationwide reunification elections promised at Geneva were simply not happening. The Southern Republic refused to participate. The Americans refused to push for them. That political path to reunification was slamming shut. The military path, slowly, was tearing open. Right around this time, the very first targeted assassinations of rural Mekong Delta officials kicked off. School teachers loyal to Saigon, local administrators, and Kun Lao party members in distant districts simply started vanishing. At first, the killing seemed sporadic, easy to blame on bandits or petty local feuds. By 1958, they were no longer sporadic. By 1959, they were terrifyingly systematic. The president and his brother had built a republic. Now, that republic was a target. That first assassination attempt happened at a county fair. It was February 22, 1957, just over 4 months before that triumphant arrival in Washington. The president traveled to the central highlands city of Buon Ma Thuot. He was there to open the Tsao Plateau Economic Fair, hoping to boost agricultural trade in a region where his republic's authority was dangerously thin. He stood on a wooden platform beside his cabinet members. A military band played the national anthem. The crowd was thick. A man stepped out from the visiting merchant section. He raised a submachine gun and opened fire from roughly 20 meters away. But the shooter totally missed his primary target. Instead, an official seated right next to the president took the hit. Vietnamese government sources from the time identified the wounded man as the Secretary of State for Agrarian Reform. History books still argue over whether he survived or died soon after. What nobody disputes is that the president walked away without a scratch. The gunman tried to fire again, but his weapon jammed. Security detail tackled him alive. The arrested man gave the name Ha Minh Tri.
but police investigators later figured out his real name was Phan Van Dien. Born up north in Nha An province back in 1935, he had been operating down south under deep cover for years. He was a devoted communist operative, taking orders straight from the Southern Regional Party Committee, the Su Wi Nam Bo. As he later confessed, the Bun Matut ambush was actually his third try at killing the president. His first attempt happened in the fall of 1955 at the Cao Dai Holy See in Tay Ninh. He planned a grenade and gunfire ambush for a ceremonial visit, but the president changed his schedule last minute and slipped away. The second plot targeted Christmas Eve of 1956, right inside central Saigon's Notre Dame Cathedral. Ha Minh Tri and his crew were literally sitting in the third pew. But again, the schedule shifted.
The head of state attended mass that night at a settlement village over in Duqua in Long An province. After Bun Matut, the assassin went straight to prison. He stayed locked up until 1965, 2 full years after his 3-time target was finally dead. The international press shrugged off the Bun Matut attack as the work of one isolated extremist. The president's office called it hard proof of communist subversion, while the American embassy just filed the paperwork away. In 1957, the story barely touched the glowing international narrative of the Asian miracle. That May state visit went perfectly to plan. Manhattan threw its parade. Time magazine ran its cover, inside the Independence Palace. However, the attack hardened into a permanent worldview. The president and his brother now knew for absolute certain that the Southern Communist movement wasn't just spreading propaganda anymore. They were actively waging a quiet, vicious war against the head of state himself. The lesson the brothers took from this would brutally dictate the next few years of Vietnamese governance. They decided this shadow war demanded tools that ordinary cops simply could not provide. In May of 1959, the Republic of Vietnam's National Assembly pushed through legislation known simply by its terrifying catalog number, Law 1059. It set up special military tribunals to try anyone suspected of communist subversion, operating completely outside the civilian justice system. The judges handed down only 2 possible sentences: life behind bars or death by guillotine. Zero chance for appeal. These mobile tribunals actually traveled from province to province in heavy trucks, dragging the guillotines right along with them. Saigon justified the draconian law as an emergency measure against a hidden, armed enemy. But human rights groups, foreign reporters, and South Vietnamese opposition leaders slammed it as a brutal return to extrajudicial state violence. The actual body count from the tribunals is still debated today. Vietnamese state records claim tens of thousands of victims, while Western academics estimate the broader 1950s anti-communist campaign executed anywhere from 12,000 to far more than that. But nobody disputes the sheer terror Law 1059 unleashed. In rural districts, it built an apparatus of fear that dragged in people far beyond the communist underground. Suspected sympathizers, relatives of old resistance fighters, and poor peasants who once served on Viet Minh village committees against the French. All of them were suddenly fair game. Out in the rural Mekong Delta and Central Coast, the political blowback was a total disaster for Saigon. The law didn't crush the underground, it expanded it. Previously neutral villagers were pushed to the brink. By the late 50s, they were actively hiding, feeding, and tipping off the cadres who promised to protect them from the rolling guillotines. Up in Hanoi, the Vietnamese Workers' Party leadership watched this chaos unfold. In January 1959, during the 15th plenum of the Central Committee, they passed Resolution 15.
For the first time since the country was carved in two, the party officially authorized armed struggle in the South. The political road to reunification was dead. The military path was wide open. The cadres down south had been waiting for this authorization, and they acted on it almost immediately.
The targeted killings of local officials beginning in 1957 and 1958 escalated heavily through 1959 and into 1960. Bridges were blown apart, granaries raided, loyal school teachers were murdered inside their own homes. By late 1960, the Republic's administrative presence across the rural Mekong Delta and Central Coast had been entirely hollowed out from below. On December 20th, 1960, in a Tay Ninh province clearing near the Cambodian border, Southern political and religious figures made an announcement. Directed by Hanoi's Workers' Party, they formed a new group. They called it the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, the Mac Trung Dân Tộc Giải Phóng Miền Nam Vietnam. Publicly, the front claimed to be a grassroots Southern coalition of nationalists, Buddhists, intellectuals, and peasants fighting a foreign-backed Saigon dictatorship. But the real command structure ran straight to the Northern Politburo. Saigon refused to grant them any nationalist legitimacy. They used a different name entirely, the Viet Cong, the Vietnamese Communists. The name stuck. Within a year, the American press, the military, and the international diplomatic community had all adopted it. That simple shorthand carried a very specific framing of the conflict,
A framing that would carry heavy consequences for the next 15 years.
While the countryside burned, the political ground inside Saigon was shifting. For the first time since 1955, the earth was starting to give way right under the president's feet. On April 26, 1960, 18 prominent non-communist political figures gathered in central Saigon. They met at the Caravel Hotel, a relatively new spot, heavy with foreign correspondents and diplomats. These were former cabinet members, intellectuals, religious leaders, and elder statesmen of the nationalist movement. Many had served in earlier governments. A few were even the president's allies during the republic's brutal early days. They were men of serious public weight. Heavyweights like former Vice President Truong Van Van and the highly respected nationalist elder Phan Cac Su. What they produced became known as the Caravel Manifesto. The language was measured, respectful. It spoke directly to the president, asking for specific reforms. End the concentration of power inside the immediate family. Open the political floor to non-communist opposition. Strip the Kun Lao Party of its special privileges. Bring back real press freedom. And reorganize the armed forces. Let competent commanders actually do their jobs without heavy political interference. The manifesto was not a coup attempt. It was not a communist document. At its core, it was a plea from the Republic's own nationalists. Broaden the political base now, before the communist insurgency expanded any further. The president answered with total silence. No formal reply ever came. Over the next few months, signers noticed their movements restricted, phones tapped, businesses quietly disrupted. After the chaos that November, several were arrested and prosecuted, sometimes for things they had absolutely nothing to do with. The opposition physician, Phan Quang Dan, was locked up for years. These men were not a network of conspirators. They were, in many ways, the last surviving nationalist intelligentsia of southern Vietnam. By ignoring their criticism entirely, the president left them zero ground to stand on inside the system he built. By late 1960, some of them stopped looking inside the system altogether. The communist insurgency was running hot across most of the rural South. The non-communist opposition had been completely shut down. Over at the American Embassy, Ambassador Elbridge Durbrow was firing off pointed cables to Washington. He described a severely isolated president and a family strangling the machinery of state. Meanwhile, junior officers in the Army of the Republic of Vietnam were getting restless.
The elite airborne units, trained to incredibly high standards by American advisors, started whispering among themselves about what needed to change. What they did not realize, what almost nobody in Saigon understood, was how short the jump was from quiet anger in the officer corps to actual armed rebellion. In November of 1960, that distance would be measured in hours, not months. Paratroopers pushed into central Saigon just before dawn on November 11, 1960.
They rolled out in trucks from the Tan Son Nhut Air Base, home to the elite airborne brigade since the Republic began. Leading the charge was Colonel Nguyen Chan Thi. He was a tough, respected combat officer who made his name fighting the Binh Xuyen and religious militias 5 years prior. His inner circle included Lieutenant Colonel Vuong Van Dong, Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Trio Hong, and Captain Phan Lac Tuyen. Their public goal was political reform. Their actual target that morning was the Independence Palace. By 6 in the morning, paratroopers held the radio station, major intersections, and the main approaches to the palace. The president and his family were trapped inside. Heavy fighting erupted between the airborne troops and the loyalist palace guard. Machine guns chewed the air. Mortar rounds slammed into the grounds. Just 2 blocks away, the American embassy locked its gates and waited in the dark. The first phone calls from the president's office signaled a willingness to negotiate. He offered concessions to the rebel commanders. He talked about reforming the cabinet, about finally broadening the government's base. He simply asked for a temporary ceasefire to calmly discuss their demands. The rebels took the bait. Encouraged by what looked like the rapid collapse of the regime, they agreed to halt the shooting. It was the mistake that completely destroyed them. While those negotiations dragged through the morning of November 11th, the president's brother was busy. Ngo Dinh Diem sat in another room, on a separate line, dialing loyalist commanders outside Saigon. The 5th Division at Bien Hoa, the 7th Division at My Tho. Armor and artillery outfits scattered across the southern Mekong Delta, operating in the president's name. New issued precise orders. Loyal units were to mobilize immediately and crush the rebellion in the capital. The men who responded fastest would end up shaping the next 3 years of South Vietnamese military politics. Colonel Chung Ping Kim commanded forces in My Tho. He rushed units toward Saigon by truck convoy. Lieutenant Colonel Huyen Van Cao, a Catholic officer fiercely loyal to the family, brought up the 7th Division. Lieutenant Colonel Bui Tsing and Major Lu Ding Sun threw in extra muscle. Within hours of that desperate call, several thousand loyalist troops were tearing north up the roads, heading straight for the capital. By the early hours of November 12th, the paratroopers holding central Saigon realized they were trapped. The peace talks were just a stalling tactic. Those shiny reform promises from yesterday afternoon were entirely fake. Loyalist armor was already closing in from multiple directions. The airborne units simply lacked the manpower and the heavy logistics to survive a sustained fight against mechanized forces bearing down on them. The fighting in the streets that morning was short, but incredibly brutal. Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Trio Hong died in the crossfire. The remaining senior conspirators knew it was over. Colonel T, Lieutenant Colonel Dong, and a handful of officers scrambled onto a transport plane at Tan Son Nhut. They fled to Cambodia, claiming political asylum. By the afternoon of November 12th, the Republic's government had total control of its capital once again. But the aftermath of this failed coup was where the real, lasting damage was done. The president survived. He bought time with fake negotiations while secretly mobilizing a massive military counterattack. The maneuver worked perfectly, but it carried a heavy price tag, one that wouldn't become fully visible for almost 3 years. The Army's officer corps had just learned a very dark lesson about the president's word. Promises made to subordinates under pressure meant absolutely nothing once the pressure was removed. The military filed that lesson away, In the weeks following the collapse, security services hunted down a wide net of suspected sympathizers. Sure, some arrests targeted officers and politicians actually involved in the plot, but others were grabbed simply because they had publicly criticized the government in the past. Caught up in this massive sweep was the writer Nguyen Tuong Tam, famous across Vietnamese literature under his pen name Nhiet Linh. Nhiet Linh stood as a giant of 20th century Vietnamese literature. He founded the Tu Loc Van Duan, the self-reliant literary group, back in the 1930s. For a whole generation, his novels including Duan Tuet, Lan Lung, and Doi Ban practically defined modern fiction in Vietnam. In 1946, he even served briefly in Ho Chi Minh's first cabinet before abandoning the communist movement entirely.
By the time he returned to nationalist politics in the South, he was merely a peripheral figure in the events of November 1960, far more sympathetic than actually active. The government did not prosecute him right away. Instead, they built a case slowly over the following 2.5 years, eventually scheduling a trial for the summer of 1963. Looking back, going after a man with his literary stature became one of the most revealing political choices of the Republic's later years. Yet the tense atmosphere following the coup in late 1960 and early 1961 created immediate fallout. The Caravel signatories from that April faced even tighter restrictions. Several were detained. The political breathing room for any non-communist opposition inside the Republic was collapsing fast. Outside Vietnam, 1961 introduced a new American administration. John Fitzgerald Kennedy took the oath of office on January 20th, 1961. The young Massachusetts senator who befriended the Vietnamese exile back in the early 1950s, the man who once called Vietnam the cornerstone of the free world in Southeast Asia, was now President of the United States. His approach to Vietnam rested in the hands of men who lingered around the previous administration, but now wielded far more power. That inner circle included Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, and General Maxwell Taylor.
In October of 1961, the Kennedy administration sent General Taylor and Deputy National Security Advisor Walt Rostow on a fact-finding mission to Saigon. They spent about 2 weeks on the ground, holding meetings with the president, his brother Ngo, American military advisors, and various Vietnamese officials. When they returned to Washington, their report pushed for a massive expansion of the American advisory effort. To prove American commitment, they suggested sending in 8,000 combat troops, disguised as flood relief personnel. President Kennedy rejected the troop recommendation. He did, however, accept the broader push for expansion. Signed on November 22, 1961, National Security Action Memorandum 111 authorized major increases in American advisors, equipment, and operational involvement. The program was set to explode, growing from roughly 3,000 American military personnel in early 1962 to over 16,000 by late 1963. The engine driving this expansion was formally established on February 8, 1962, when the Defense Department activated the Military Assistance Command Vietnam. Under the leadership of General Paul Harkins, this new command absorbed existing advisory groups and took direct responsibility for guiding the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. General Harkins himself was a Second World War veteran who had served under General George Patton. He quickly established his main headquarters at Tan Son Nhut. While the new American command was setting up, the president's brother Ngo rolled out an ambitious program aimed right at the rural insurgency. They called it the Strategic Hamlet Program, the Ep Chin Luc. Theoretically, it drew heavily on the British counterinsurgency experience in Malaya from the previous decade. To guide the effort, the Republic of Vietnam had even hired Sir Robert Thompson, the British expert who directed that very campaign in Malaya, to serve as a high-level consultant. Thompson advised taking things slow. He suggested starting in secure areas and building outward.
making absolutely sure each fortified hamlet had the political and economic structure needed to win over its people. That advice was largely ignored. Ngo slammed on the accelerator, pushing the program nationwide at breakneck speed. By mid-1963, officials claimed over 8,500 hamlets were fully finished. The reality was a mess. Construction quality, village leadership, and actual loyalty to the Republic varied wildly from place to place. Forcing peasant families to relocate just bred bitter rural resentment across multiple districts. Promised building materials rarely arrived. In plenty of areas, the defensive fortifications were nothing but lines drawn on a piece of paper. The program also hid a fatal flaw. One of the senior officials Ngo completely trusted was Colonel Pham Ngoc Thao, a charismatic, highly capable officer who had climbed the ranks right into the presidential inner circle. Nobody knew it until after the war, but Colonel Thao was actually a deep cover agent for the communist movement, operating inside the Republic of Vietnam's government and armed forces. His covert orders from Hanoi were clear: destroy the Hamlet program from the inside. Later investigations revealed he deliberately fueled the chaotic accelerated rollout across several regions. Pushing for a rapid expansion he knew the Republic simply could not handle. He was not the only reason the strategy collapsed. It fell apart for a dozen different reasons, but his sabotage added a heavy layer of dysfunction that the regime completely failed to see at the time. By the end of 1962, the Republic was losing its grip on the countryside. The Hamlet program looked like progress on official maps, but down in the dirt, it was just breeding anger over forced relocations and torn-up villages. Meanwhile, the communist insurgency had matured into a highly organized military force, now fully capable of fighting in battalion strength. Watching the political games inside the palace and listening to the rising frustration of American advisors, the senior officer corps of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam began asking themselves the exact same questions those airborne paratroopers had raised 2 years earlier. Only this time, those questions would not end with a single morning's miscalculation. The first bomb struck the Independence Palace just after 7 o'clock in the morning. It was February 27, 1962. The president woke early, attended mass in the small palace chapel, and was reading documents in his private quarters when the explosion rocked the foundation. 2 propeller-driven planes from the Republic of Vietnam Air Force had abandoned a scheduled strike mission against communist targets down in the Mekong Delta, banking hard and turning back toward the capital. They were flying American-built A-1 Sky Raiders, single-engine attack bombers the Vietnamese military called the AD-6. In the cockpit sat Lieutenant Pham Phu Quoc and Second Lieutenant Nguyen Van Cu. Their only target was the building they just hit. These men were not communist spies. They were Air Force officers raised in non-Catholic nationalist families. Cu's father, Nguyen Van Luc, was actually a major figure in the Dai Viet Quoc Dun Dang, a nationalist political party active since the 1940s, and the government had locked him up for political reasons. According to their later interrogations, the pilots acted out of absolute certainty that the regime was totally beyond reform. To them, wiping out the family at the center of power was the one and only way to force real political change. They hammered the palace with rockets and heavy machine gun fire, dropping bombs of varying sizes. The largest, nearly 400 kilograms, slammed right into the section housing the president's private quarters. It tore straight through the roof, lodging deep in the structure, but miraculously failed to detonate. Other strikes caused massive structural damage across the West Wing, killing several members of the palace staff. The president's sister-in-law, Madame Ngo, was upstairs in her own room when the attack hit. The floor literally collapsed beneath her feet, dropping her to a lower level. She was injured, but she survived. The president escaped without a scratch. His brother Ngo was unhurt.
Even the children, including his 8-year-old daughter, Ngo Dinh Diem, survived untouched.
Less than an hour after the dust settled, the surviving family members were rushed to the secondary presidential residence at the Jialong Palace, just a few blocks away. Following the raid, Lieutenant Coup flew his plane across the border into Cambodia, where Prince Norodom Sihanouk's government granted him political asylum. The other pilot, Lieutenant Quoc, took heavy anti-aircraft fire from a naval ship anchored in the Saigon River. His plane went down hard near the village of Na Bay, just south of the capital. Miraculously, he survived the wreckage, only to be immediately captured. He would sit in a prison cell until the political earthquake of the following year. The structural damage to the Independence Palace was catastrophic. In the weeks that followed, the president made his decision. The sprawling estate, the seat of French colonial governors since 1868, the home he had occupied for 7 years, would be completely demolished. A massive new presidential palace would rise on the exact same ground. The president personally picked Vietnamese architect Ngo Viet Thu to design the replacement. Construction started in 1962 and stretched out for years. But the president would not live long enough to see the building finished. For the rest of his presidency, the family lived down the street at Jialong Palace. That February 1962 aerial attack sent shock waves through the regime, altering its trajectory for the next 20 months.
Inside the inner circle, paranoia hardened into absolute certainty. The threat to the family was coming from everywhere at once. Communist underground fighters had tried to assassinate the president 3 times. Airborne troops had nearly ousted him in a ground assault. Now, his own air force had tried to kill him from the sky. The family drew one dark conclusion. The only people they could trust were those who shared their faith, their history, and in some cases, their blood. The second shift was purely administrative. The Republic of Vietnam's Special Forces, commanded by Colonel Le Quang Thong, were heavily expanded. They morphed into a private protection squad, loyal only to the family. Originally, the United States had trained and armed these units to fight communist guerrillas in the deep countryside. But after 1962, their men and resources were pulled back to Saigon, repurposed to guard the palace and shield the president's brother. It was a massive redirection of military power, and it would bring devastating consequences in the summer of 1963. Finally, the psychological toll. The president grew deeply withdrawn. Those working closely with him watched him retreat, leaning heavily on his brother's judgment. Public appearances dropped off. His patience with American advisors, especially those pushing for administrative reform, burned out entirely. He still attended daily mass. He still worked well past midnight. He still personally reviewed every major government document. But the circle of voices he actually listened to had tightened into a knot.
While the old palace was being torn down and rebuilt, the American press corps in Saigon was starting to publish stories the regime deeply despised. A new wave of young American journalists hit Vietnam between 1961 and 1962. David Halberstam was filing for the New York Times. Neil Sheehan reported for United Press International. Malcolm Brown and Peter Arnett were with the Associated Press. These reporters were much younger than the senior diplomats and generals they covered. They spent time out in the dirt, talking to American field advisors who were getting fed up and willing to talk off the record. They drove out to rural districts to look at the Strategic Hamlet program themselves, and they wrote down exactly what they saw, not what the government fed them. This reporting style triggered a massive confrontation on January 2, 1963, at a tiny village in Din Tung province down in the Mekong Delta. The village was called Ep Bac. The Republic of Vietnam's 7th Division launched a joint strike against roughly 350 communist insurgents. They brought overwhelming force, 1,400 government troops, heavily backed by American helicopter units and armored personnel carriers. The whole operation was supposed to be a showcase,
a clean demonstration of the deadly new tactics the American advisory team had spent months building. Instead, it was an absolute disaster. The communist fighters held their ground. Government helicopters were ripped out of the sky by heavy fire.
Armored carriers were abruptly halted by their own panicked crews. Carefully planned, coordinated assaults simply evaporated. By nightfall, the insurgent battalion slipped away entirely, escaping through wide gaps in the military's lines. The Republic of Vietnam took heavy losses, over 80 soldiers dead, more than 100 wounded. 3 American advisors were killed, 8 injured. 5 choppers were completely destroyed, with several others badly damaged. The senior American advisor on the ground was Lieutenant Colonel John Paul Vann, a career Army man from Virginia and a Korean War veteran. Vann was famously intense and honest, to the point of risking his own career. When reporters arrived from Saigon after the gunfire stopped, Vann talked. His breakdown of the battle became one of the most consequential statements from any American officer during the entire advisory period. He bluntly called the fight a miserable damn performance. He blamed the defeat on senior government commanders who refused to actually engage the enemy. Cowardice, he said, driven directly by political orders coming straight down from the palace. The dispatches coming out of Abuk, especially the stories filed by Sheehan and Halberstam, completely shattered the official embassy narrative. General Harkins and the military headquarters insisted the battle was a tactical victory, but the reporters standing in the mud called it a devastating defeat. For years, the American public had been told their side was steadily winning a tough counterinsurgency. Now, for the very first time, they were reading a united block of journalism that proved the exact opposite. Over at the Independence Palace, still a noisy pile of rubble under construction, the mood turned to pure rage. The president's brother and his sister-in-law went on the offensive. They gave hostile interviews, accusing the American press corps of bias, communist sympathies, and outright sabotage of an allied wartime government. Madame Ngo stepped into the spotlight, finding a sharp public voice that would dominate 1963. She gave biting interviews in both French and English. Her quotes were printed across the globe, and by standard diplomatic measures, her words were absolutely devoid of sympathy. By the spring of 1963, the regime was openly at war with the foreign press. But the deeper political fracture had nothing to do with reporters. It was about the vast Buddhist majority of the Vietnamese population. The president himself was Catholic. His older brother, Ngo Dinh Thuc, served as the Archbishop of Hue, the highest-ranking Catholic prelate in Vietnam. Meanwhile, his younger brother Nhu had built the Kun Lao Party into a brutal political machine that handed out government jobs, military ranks, and business licenses strictly to fellow Catholics. For years, Buddhist religious life was smothered under heavy state restrictions that Catholics never had to face. That spring, in the city of Hue, those religious restrictions finally sparked a massive confrontation. The regime was totally caught off guard. It was a numbers game, waiting to break a country with a huge Buddhist majority ruled by a rigid Catholic state. That contradiction had been brewing for 9 long years. In May of 1963, it finally exploded. The Buddhist flag crisis started out as a simple administrative dispute. In early May, up in the central city of Hue, the Catholic community spent days flying the white and gold banners of the Holy See. They were celebrating the 25th anniversary of the local archbishop, the president's older brother. The streets around the main cathedral were beautifully decorated. Bright flags hung freely from both public offices and private homes. The local government didn't raise a single objection. The Buddhist Vesak holiday, honoring the birth of the Buddha, was set for May 8th. Local Buddhists were getting ready.
planning to fly their own 5-colored international banner. But just 2 days before the festival, Hue city officials delivered a sudden mandate. Flying religious flags in public spaces was now strictly banned under existing laws. The exact same laws, they claimed, that had supposedly governed the massive Catholic celebration just a week prior. The blatant hypocrisy was staggering. Buddhist leaders immediately protested, pointing out that nobody had enforced those rules against the Catholic banners. But the local government refused to budge. On the evening of May 8th, several thousand frustrated Buddhists crowded outside the Hue radio station.
They were waiting for a scheduled broadcast by senior monk Thic Tri Quang, who had spent the entire day fighting the discriminatory flag ban. But the station went dead. The broadcast was pulled. As the massive crowd grew restless, local officials sent in heavy security forces complete with armored vehicles to clear the streets. The officer in charge of security for the entire province was Major Dang Si. He was Catholic, and the religious weight of his command was about to dictate exactly how the protesters viewed the violence that followed. The precise events at the radio station that evening remain debated among historians. Yet the terrible facts are clear. Explosions, gunfire, 9 people dead, including children. The provincial government blamed a communist plot, claiming an outside agent tossed explosives into the crowd. Buddhist organizers, however, held the Republic of Vietnam's security forces responsible, accusing them of using fragmentation weapons against unarmed civilians. A subsequent investigation, ordered by the new government after November, would finally determine that state security forces bore the primary blame. Major Dang Si would eventually stand trial and be imprisoned. Following the horror of May 8th, the presidential palace simply refused to accept responsibility. In public, the president's office doubled down on the communist plot narrative. Buddhist organizations had initially asked for a simple inquiry. Now, they escalated. They released a 5-point manifesto. It demanded an end to the flag regulation, compensation for grieving families, religious freedom, and absolute accountability for those who ordered the killings.
Over the coming weeks, the government engaged the Buddhist leadership in drawn-out negotiations, yet they offered absolutely nothing of substance in return. The talks collapsed entirely. By early June, a localized administrative dispute in Hue had transformed into a nationwide religious movement. Protests swept into Saigon. Monks and nuns marched through the capital in saffron robes, holding banners high to demand religious equality. The foreign press had grown increasingly critical of the regime since the prior winter. Now, they found a massive political crisis unfolding right in front of their cameras. On the morning of June 11, 1963, a slow procession marched into a busy intersection in central Saigon. At the corner of Phan Dinh Phum Street and Le Van Duet Street, roughly 350 Buddhist monks and nuns moved toward the heart of the city. An Austin Westminster sedan led the way. The car stopped. An elderly man stepped from the back seat. His name was Thic Quang Duc. He was a senior monk, having spent his life in the temples of central and southern Vietnam. Historical accounts suggest he was somewhere in his late 60s or early 70s. The old monk sat in the lotus position, directly in the intersection. A younger monk poured a 5-gallon can of fuel over his robes and shaved head. Then, he lit a match. Flames engulfed him completely. He did not move. He made no sound. He held his posture until the very end. Associated Press photographer Malcolm Brown knew they were coming. Buddhist contacts had tipped him off the night before. He was waiting at the intersection with his camera ready. The resulting photograph showed an elderly man in flames, seated with absolute composure on a Saigon street. It became one of the defining, most widely reproduced images of the 20th century. It won World Press Photo of the Year by 1964. Brown would take home the Pulitzer Prize for international reporting inside a small temple in central Saigon. Organizers handed out copies of a testament Thic Quang Duc had written in advance. It framed his death as a pure religious offering. The letter simply asked the President of the Republic
to show compassion to his people and ensure religious equality. There were no new political demands, only the same requests the Buddhist movement had pleaded for since May. Decades later, that very document would sit on public display in Saigon, featured in a 2018 exhibition at the Independence Palace itself. The president responded to the immolation with a national address. He used measured language to call for calm, promising that negotiations with the Buddhist leadership would continue. But the speech failed completely. It was too late. By the time he spoke, the international press had already broadcast Malcolm Brown's photograph across the globe. Within 24 hours, the haunting image of the burning monk was sitting on the desk of every major newspaper editor in North America and Europe. Yet the most destructive political response did not come from the president himself.
The situation escalated further due to remarks from the president's sister-in-law. Throughout that spring, Madame Ngo had been frequently interviewed, but her comments in the weeks following the tragic events at the pagodas permanently altered the regime's international standing. She spoke of the crisis with a dismissive tone. She used a term, a culinary reference that much of the world perceived as a profound lack of empathy toward the religious movement. She further suggested that continued protests would not sway the administration's position. These remarks were widely reported in Time magazine, the New York Times, and on international television networks, appearing in newspapers across the globe. As the summer of 1963 progressed, the crisis intensified. 5 more individuals followed the same path of extreme protest in cities across the Republic. Each event was documented and shared internationally, and the cumulative impact on global opinion, especially among the American public, was absolute and decisive. Inside the palace walls, the president's brother decided the crisis required a definitive resolution. Negotiations had stalled, and the streets remained filled with demonstrators. He began to perceive the pagodas organizing the movement, specifically the Sa Loi Pagoda, as political command centers rather than religious sites. Fearing that the movement had evolved into a coordinated political opposition, the administration initiated a direct intervention against the pagodas. By late August, the operational plan was finalized. Execution fell to Colonel Lê Quang Tong's Special Forces, the exact same units assigned to protect the ruling family after the previous year's bombing. But there was a twist. The Special Forces would wear regular army uniforms. This way, the public would blame the national military, shielding the family's personal guard from the fallout. The pagoda raids began just after midnight on August 21, 1963. Backed by combat police, Special Forces struck Sa Loi Pagoda in central Saigon, the Tu Dam Pagoda in Hue, and other major Buddhist centers in one coordinated sweep. They smashed through the doors. Monks and nuns were brutally beaten with rifle butts. Sacred altars were destroyed. Those who resisted were immediately arrested. Over 1,400 monks, nuns, and lay supporters were dragged into custody that night alone. Several lost their lives. The movement's senior leaders were captured or forced into hiding. A few of the most prominent monks barely escaped, finding desperate refuge inside the American Embassy compound in Saigon. The August 21st pagoda raids became the political breaking point. The regime would never recover. The international backlash was immediate and savage. For months, Washington had struggled to maintain a coherent policy toward its troubled ally. Now, defending the Republic of Vietnam was completely untenable to American voters. The Saigon government had just assaulted the sacred institutions of the country's Buddhist majority, all during a time of peaceful protest. Within 24 hours, the grim reports and horrific photos of the midnight raids were plastered across American newspapers. High-profile resignations from within the regime followed almost instantly. The Republic's foreign minister, Vu Van Mo, quit his post in utter disgust, shaving his head like a Buddhist monk. In Washington, the Republic's ambassador to the United States resigned to protest the government's sheer brutality. That ambassador was Deng Vang Chung, Madame Ngo's own father.
His wife, Tung Ti Nam Jung, the Republic's permanent observer at the United Nations, stepped down right beside him. The president's sister-in-law had just watched her own family publicly sever ties with the ruling regime. On the morning of August 22nd, cables from the Saigon embassy started pouring into Washington, detailing the previous night's horrors. The new American ambassador, Henry Cabot Lodge, had been confirmed less than 2 months prior. He was not even in Saigon yet. He was scheduled to touch down at Tung Sung Nyuk that very evening. The political reality in Washington was about to violently shift. In Saigon, the ruling family did not yet realize it, but their political survival was already over. The critical cable was drafted that Saturday, inside an unusually quiet Washington, August 24, 1963. President John Kennedy was at the family compound in Hyannisport, Massachusetts. Secretary of State Dean Rusk was in New York, and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara was traveling. The senior officials who normally gathered for a decision of this magnitude were scattered for the weekend. Yet the cable that emerged that afternoon, addressed to Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge in Saigon, marked as number 243, would dictate every remaining moment of the Vietnamese president's life. The primary drafters were Roger Hilsman, Averell Harriman, and Michael Forrestal. George Ball cleared it, reaching Rusk by phone in New York. While President Kennedy authorized the move from Cape Cod, the instructions to Ambassador Lodge were uncompromising. Washington could no longer tolerate a reality where the president's brother directed the brutal suppression of Buddhist institutions. Lodge was authorized to tell Vietnamese military commanders that the United States would not stop them from removing the brother from power. And if the president himself fell during the process, America was fully prepared to accept new leadership. The precise language of the cable was not an order to organize a coup. It was simply clearance for one. That distinction mattered deeply to the men drafting it. It would mean absolutely nothing in Saigon. By the time senior officials returned to Washington on Monday, the administration was openly fractured. General Maxwell Taylor, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, opposed the cable's direction. Over at MACV headquarters in Saigon, General Paul Harkins fought it. Director of Central Intelligence John McCone and senior CIA official William Colby both pushed back hard. Former Ambassador Frederick Nolting, a man who spent 2 years building a working relationship with the Republic of Vietnam's president, was entirely against it. The argument was simple. The document was rushed through by too few people over a quiet weekend, completely bypassing standard review. In a private dictation recorded months later, released by his presidential library in 1998, President Kennedy himself admitted the cable was badly drafted. He acknowledged it never should have been sent on a Saturday, but he refused to withdraw it. The fallout hit Saigon almost immediately. Ambassador Lodge had arrived at his post only days prior, but he quickly used CIA channels to reach out. He targeted senior officers in the Army of the Republic of Vietnam who were already questioning the regime. The operational liaison was Lucien Conay. He was a French-born American intelligence officer who had operated in the country since the Second World War, maintaining 2 decades of personal ties with top Vietnamese generals. By late August, Conay was sitting down with General Tren Van Doan, the president's own senior military advisor. 2 parallel processes quietly advanced through the autumn. Both played out against a growing paranoia in Washington. Several American officials suspected the president's brother, Ngo, was testing back-channel contacts with Hanoi over the summer. His alleged middleman was Mieczysław Maneli, a Polish diplomat on the International Control Commission. Observers argued then, and historians still debate now, whether this was a genuine push for peace or just a tactical bluff to squeeze the Americans. What we do know is that the mere rumor of these talks terrified Washington.
American leaders feared the Saigon regime was quietly dealing away their strategic foothold. The first process was a massive American policy review. Through high-level meetings, President Kennedy tried to get a clearer read on the ground before fully committing to the August cable. He sent General Victor Krulak and Joseph Mendenhall to Vietnam that September on a fact-finding mission. But the two men came back with wildly conflicting stories. Krulak insisted the military campaign against the communist insurgency was succeeding. Mendenhall claimed the entire regime was facing political collapse. After listening to their joint briefing, the president openly asked if they had even visited the same country. Later that same month, Washington launched a heavier mission. Secretary of Defense McNamara and General Taylor flew to Saigon together. Upon returning, they reported military progress on the battlefield, but warned that the current government was a massive political liability. They suggested turning the screws slowly. American economic aid would be cut back. The special forces commanded by Colonel Le Quang Tum, the exact units behind the August pagoda raids, would lose their direct American funding. Slowly, systematically, new forms of pressure would be applied. Meanwhile, a second process was unfolding in the shadows. The coup itself was slowly being assembled. The senior officers leading the charge were heavyweights. General Giang Van Minh was affectionately known across the military as Big Min. General Tren Van Doan acted as the main coordinator and Conan's key contact.
General Le Von Kim brought deep staff experience, while General Mai Hu Suan commanded the operational forces. The final piece was General Ton Tut Ding, Saigon's military governor. Further down the ranks sat Colonel Nguyen Van Thieu, the man who would eventually become president of the Second Republic of Vietnam. General Ton Tut Ding's involvement was the ultimate key to the entire operation. To the presidential family, Ding was unshakable. He was Catholic, rapidly promoted under the president's personal wing, and deeply trusted. They made him military governor of Saigon specifically because they believed he would hold the line in a crisis. His betrayal changed everything. It meant the capital's guard forces would simply ignore the call to defend the palace when the first shots rang out. Throughout October, Ding quietly worked with his co-conspirators. He carefully shifted units around the city, isolating the regime's loyalist forces without raising a single alarm. The most critical maneuver involved Colonel Le Quang Tum's special forces. The regime counted on these heavily armed units for palace defense, but in the final days of October, they were abruptly ordered out of Saigon, told they were desperately needed to fight communist forces out in the countryside. It was a massive vulnerability. With Tum's men scattered, the family's physical security was stripped away before the coup even began. American economic pressure only deepened that isolation. Slashing aid and freezing money to the special forces sent a glaring signal to every savvy officer in the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. The United States was pulling its protective shield away from the family. During these weeks, the Vietnamese piastre plummeted against the American dollar. Imports grew painfully expensive. Government paychecks suddenly bought less. Washington wasn't just sending political signals anymore, they were writing them into the financial markets of the capital. The coup kicked off at 1:30 in the afternoon on Friday, November 1st, 1963. It was the Catholic Feast of All Saints. Conspirators struck the capital's key facilities all at once. Loyalist commanders who wouldn't bend to political pressure were dealt with directly. Colonel Le Quang Tum was lured to the Joint General Staff compound at Tan Son Nhut for a fake meeting, where he was immediately killed. Naval Commander Ho Tun Quyen, a man widely expected to fight back, had already been assassinated that morning by his own subordinate officers. The palace's communication lines were completely severed. Soon, radio broadcasts blared the news the army was taking down the government. Trapped at the Jialong Palace, the president called Ambassador Lodge at the American embassy, demanding to know Washington's stance. Lodge played it carefully,
He claimed he wasn't fully informed on the ground situation, but he added that if the president wanted to flee the country, the embassy could arrange safe passage. The president refused.
Remembering his survival of a similar crisis in November of 1960, he was convinced loyalist forces would rally to his side. All afternoon and into the night, he desperately tried to reach provincial commanders for help, but the lines were dead. No relief column was coming. Late that evening, well after dark, the president and his brother slipped out of the Jialong Palace. They took a service exit. The two men made their way to the home of a Chinese-Vietnamese merchant, Ma Thuyen, tucked away in the Che Lun district of the capital. They stayed the night in that house. From Ma Thuyen's residence, they kept dialing General Ton Tut Ding on the telephone. They still clung to the hope that they could persuade him to swing his troops back to the palace side. But Ding's hollow responses over the line finally made it clear. The very commander the family relied on to guard the capital was the one who orchestrated their downfall. Dawn broke on Saturday, November 2nd. The president and his brother walked the brief stretch from Ma Thuyen's house. They headed to the modest Catholic church of St. Francis Xavier in Che Lun. Locals simply called it Cha Tam. They sat through the early morning mass. Holy Communion followed. Standing inside the church, the president placed one last telephone call to the conspirators. He offered to surrender, asking only for safe passage out of the country. The generals accepted his terms. A short while later, 3 American-built M113 armored personnel carriers arrived at the church under the command of General Mai Hu Swan. The brothers were escorted out and taken into custody. They were moved inside one of the vehicles, ordered to the Joint General Staff compound. Sitting inside that same vehicle was Captain Nguyen Van Nhung, an aide to General Zung Van Min. No one outside the vehicle witnessed the transit from Cha Tam Church to Tan Son Nhut, and the exact events of that journey were only reconstructed later through investigations. By the time the transport arrived at the Joint General Staff compound, the brothers had passed away. State radio quickly broadcasted an official account, but conflicting reports soon emerged in the foreign press, challenging the government's narrative. The Republic of Vietnam's political landscape shifted irrevocably that Saturday morning, November 2nd, 1963. The individuals were taken to the Joint General Staff compound and later to St. Paul Hospital in central Saigon. Documentation and reports regarding their passing reached international journalists, and the resulting public discourse fundamentally undermined the official explanation. Half a world away in Washington, the news reached the White House on that Saturday morning. Decades later, General Maxwell Taylor recalled President John Kennedy's reaction. He stood up and left the cabinet room, visibly affected by the gravity of the situation.
Completely shaken, Kennedy had authorized that August 24th cable. He never imagined this bloody outcome. 2 days after the murders, on November 4th, 1963, he dictated a private audio note. The John F. Kennedy Presidential Library kept it hidden for over 30 years. In it, the president swallowed a bitter pill of partial responsibility. He admitted the August cable was severely flawed, drafted too fast over a single weekend. Barely 3 weeks after recording that confession, on November 22nd, Kennedy himself was gunned down in Dallas, Texas. Up north in Hanoi, the shock was palpable. The tough leadership of the Workers' Party fully expected the American government to fiercely protect its top Vietnamese partner. Taking out the only Southern leader capable of negotiating a hard bargain ruined everything. The path to a favorable diplomatic settlement was abruptly closed. The fallout in the Republic of Vietnam bled into the coming months. The Strategic Hamlet Program, the backbone of the old administration's counterinsurgency war, crumbled within weeks of the coup. Generals on the new ruling council called it a disaster. They tore down miles of fortified villages. Meanwhile, communist operatives like Colonel Pham Ngoc Thao had already infiltrated the network. With the fences coming down, they rapidly accelerated their political and military grip over the rural South. The Republic of Vietnam burned through 10 heads of state in just 20 months following the murders. The Military Revolutionary Council that launched the coup was quickly devoured by General Nguyen Khan by late January 1964.
Then came the counter-coup. Captain Nguyen Van Nhung, the officer from the armored track, suddenly turned up dead. The new bosses conveniently called it a suicide. Ngo Dinh Diem, the brother who once ruled central Vietnam from Hue, faced a firing squad on May 9, 1964. After a swift trial, Archbishop Ngo Dinh Thuc stayed firmly in Rome, never setting foot in Vietnam again. The youngest brother, Ngo Dinh Diem, vanished into French exile until his death in 1990. Madame Nhu was traveling abroad when the tanks rolled, and she never saw her homeland again. She spent nearly 50 quiet years in Rome. Yet tragedy stalked her family across borders. In 1986, her own brother, Truong Van Kiem, murdered both their parents inside their home in Washington, District of Columbia. Her eldest daughter, Lê Thuê, perished in a 1967 car crash in France. Decades later, her daughter, Lê Quyên, suffered the exact same fate near Rome in 2012. Madame Nhu quietly passed away in Rome on Easter Sunday, April 24, 2011. She was 86 years old. History's judgment of the deposed president has shifted in stark waves. For decades, American scholars painted him strictly as a stubborn autocrat whose toxic family rule made his bloody exit totally inevitable. Famous books cemented that harsh verdict. Works like Stanley Carnell's Vietnam, A History, and Neil Sheehan's A Bright, Shining Lie. But by the early 2000s, a fresh wave of historians began digging deeper. Researchers like Edward Miller of Dartmouth College, Mark Moyer, Philip Catton, and Jeffrey Stewart uncovered buried archives. They revealed a deeply complex post-colonial nationalist. His vision for Vietnam wasn't blindly authoritarian, nor was he an American puppet. To them, taking him out wasn't a triumph. It was a catastrophic strategic blunder. Inside Vietnam today, the official government line still views the First Republic with a harsh, critical eye. Yet the conversation has slowly widened. Look at the March 2018 exhibition staged right at the Independence Palace, titled From the Norodom Palace to the Independence Palace. It was co-curated with Edward Miller. The displays laid out private family photographs, dusty government archives, and the raw, handwritten testament of Thich Quang Duc. Curators didn't force-feed a single strict lesson. They simply let people stand in the room and feel the crushing contradictions of the era. This choice marked a profound shift in how the state handles its own ghosts. Today, the murdered president rests in the quiet grounds of Lai Thieu Cemetery in Binh Xuyen Province, just north of Ho Chi Minh City. His gravestone shows no political rank, no mention of the presidency at all, just his Catholic baptismal name, Gioan Bautista, meaning John the Baptist. Meanwhile, the grand Independence Palace he ordered built still anchors the center of Ho Chi Minh City. Architect Ngo Viet Thu finished it in 1966, but the man who dreamed it up never walked its halls. His rivals opened it. Eventually, the steel tanks of the People's Army of Vietnam smashed through its iron gates on April 30th, 1975. Now, it just stands as a museum. What survives from the ashes of Ngo Dinh Diem are the brutal lessons his life demands we face head-on. You cannot inherit the right to rule through your church, your bloodline, or a foreign superpower. That is the first lesson. True authority demands sweat and visible service to the vast, quiet majority. Without that, the foundation rots. The moment a government acts like the private property of a single family or faith, the rest of the nation turns its back. Second, trusting others to lead is not weakness.
It is the absolute bedrock of survival. A head of state who obsesses over minor orders, distrusts his own ministers, and leans only on his siblings hasn't actually built a state. He just built a frightened household playing dress-up. Then there is the bitter third truth of foreign alliances. A country entirely propped up by outside protection loses the right to complain when that patron casually pulls the plug. True independence means forging resources and strong alliances that never rely on a single, fickle superpower across the ocean. Fourth is the raw danger of religious favoritism. When a state openly elevates one belief system in a deeply diverse land, the marginalized majority remembers every slight. Baking discrimination into the daily bureaucracy breeds a quiet, fierce resistance. No amount of riot police or secret courts can hold that back forever.
Fifth, you have to deal with the opposition. A regime that stubbornly ignores its peaceful critics, the monks, the writers, the political dissenters, leaves them completely boxed out of the system. Cornered people will eventually burn the system down from the outside. Listening to dissent isn't a sign of surrender, it is basic survival. Finally, remember the heavy human toll exacted by closed-door politics. Palace choices always bleed down to ordinary people who never once stepped foot in those velvet rooms. Leaders who treat their citizens as mere props for some grand personal vision eventually learn a harsh truth. The country and the vision were never the same thing. These are the questions we leave you to weigh. Share your perspective in the comments. What was the actual turning point, that single moment when the path locked into place? The October 1955 referendum, the refusal to engage with the Caravel signatories, the brutal response to the Buddhist crisis, or that August cable from Washington? History rarely offers one clean answer. You tell us. Ultimately, the first president of the Republic of Vietnam built a state through sheer personal force and lost it to that exact same stubbornness. He walked away from 3 communist assassination attempts, a paratrooper mutiny, and an aerial bombing of his own home. He survived all of it. What he couldn't survive was the fallout of decisions he flatly refused to rethink. The traits making him untouchable in 1955,
They made him impossible to save by 1963. After everything, we are left with a question that has no clean ending. For 12 more years, the new nation he forged kept breathing, right up to its final day. His institutions anchored the republic. Yet those deep inner contradictions between old traditions and modernization, fierce sovereignty and foreign reliance, Catholic certainty ruling a Buddhist majority, defined an entire generation. His death solved nothing, and the long war that followed. That didn't fix it either. In some forms, they remain entirely unresolved. So we leave you with this today. A man pays a staggering personal price to build something genuinely new, only to lose everything because he refuses to adapt to his own creation. What is the deeper lesson here? Is it a fatal flaw in the leader himself? Or is it simply the impossible trap of history, crushing anyone trying to govern a fractured nation caught between global giants? Thanks for stepping back into history with us here on ARVN and United States Military. If this story stayed with you, hit subscribe and join the debate in the comments below. We have many more untold stories coming your way.